Canada's vast wilderness stretches across frozen tundras, isolated towns, and forgotten forests, where the border between civilization and the unknown grows dangerously thin. Beneath the polite facades and snow-covered landscapes lie secrets that governments have buried, tragedies that families dare not speak of, and horrors that defy rational explanation. Tonight, we descend into 10 of the most disturbing legends ever whispered across the Great White North, each one rooted in documented testimony, historical records, and eyewitness accounts that will shake your faith in what you thought you knew about our northern neighbor. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Undaily True Horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Canadian wilderness, where isolation breeds terror and the cold is not the only thing that kills. The scratching started around midnight that January night in 2019, right when I was settling into my isolated cabin deep in the Algonquin Park wilderness of northern Ontario. I was 31 then, working as a wilderness guide for an outfitter company based out of Huntsville, and I had decided to take a solo winter retreat in this remote cabin that my company maintained for off-season staff use. The place was located approximately 47 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by snowmobile during winter months, and surrounded by dense pine forests that seemed to swallow all sound and light. I remember thinking how peaceful the silence felt that first evening, how the wood stove crackled with a comforting rhythm, how the stars burned impossibly bright through the frosted windows. I was so wrong about the peace. The cabin itself was a sturdy log structure built in the 1970s, with one main room serving as kitchen and living space, a small bedroom, barely large enough for a double bed, and an outhouse positioned about 20 feet from the back door. The walls were thick, the insulation decent enough for the brutal Canadian winters, and I had stocked enough supplies to last me the planned 3 weeks of solitude I craved, after a chaotic tourist season. My nearest neighbors, if you could call them that, were a retired couple named the Tremblays, who lived in a similar cabin roughly 5 miles to the southeast, though I had no plans to visit them during my stay. That first scratch came from the north wall, the one facing deeper into the forest. It was not the sound of a branch scraping against wood or an animal brushing past the exterior. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails being dragged slowly across the logs from outside. I froze with my book still open on my lap, listening. The scratching continued for perhaps 30 seconds, moved horizontally about 6 feet along the wall, then stopped abruptly. I told myself it was a porcupine, or perhaps a raccoon, though both explanations felt hollow even as I thought them. The temperature outside was minus 28 degrees Celsius that night. Nothing should have been moving around out there. I forced myself to continue reading, but my attention kept drifting to that north wall, waiting for the sound to return. It did not come back that night, and eventually I fell into an uneasy sleep around 2 a.m. in the morning. When I woke the next day, I bundled up and went outside to investigate. The snow around the cabin was pristine and untouched except for one disturbing detail. There were tracks circling the entire structure, and they were not animal tracks. They were barefoot human prints, impossibly fresh in the morning snow, each toe clearly defined, each print sinking about 3 inches deep. But the stride was wrong. The distance between prints was nearly 7 feet, far longer than any normal human gait, and there were only prints arriving at the cabin. There were no prints leading away. I spent that entire day trying to rationalize what I had seen. Perhaps someone had walked backward in their own prints. Perhaps it was a prank by locals who somehow knew I was there. Perhaps I had misread the tracks entirely. But when I returned inside and looked at the north wall from the interior, I saw something I had missed the night before. There were fresh gouges in the wood, 4 parallel lines dragged horizontally exactly where I had heard the scratching. The wood was exposed and pale beneath the weathered exterior, and the gouges were deep. at least a quarter inch into solid pine. The second night, the scratching returned at exactly midnight, but this time it was accompanied by something else: whispers. I cannot adequately describe how wrong those whispers sounded. They seemed to come from directly outside the window beside my bed, spoken in a language I did not recognize, but which carried a cadence that felt ancient and wrong. The words rose and fell in a rhythmic chant, and beneath them I could hear that same deliberate scratching circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and my hunting rifle, chambered around with shaking hands, and shouted through the door that I was armed and would shoot. The whispers stopped immediately. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. I did not sleep that night. I sat in a chair facing the door with my rifle across my lap, watching the windows, waiting for something to appear. Nothing did. But when dawn came and I went outside again, I found the tracks had multiplied. There were now dozens of those impossibly long-strided barefoot prints in the snow, all circling the cabin in a spiral pattern that tightened as it approached the walls. And in the center of the spiral, directly in front of my door, something had been arranged in the snow. It was a small pile of bones, bleached white and picked clean, arranged in a shape that resembled a human figure, but with the proportions all wrong, the limbs too long, the skull elongated. I knew then that I should leave, that something was very wrong with this place. But I also knew that snowmobiling 47 miles through dense forest in the dark was suicide. I would have to wait for daylight, and daylight was still 3 hours away. I went back inside, locked the door, pushed my dresser against it, and waited. The whispers started again around 4 a.m. in the morning, but this time they were not outside. They were coming from inside the cabin, from the bedroom, speaking in that same guttural unknown language. I could see into the bedroom from where I sat. There was nothing there, but the whispers continued, growing louder, and I realized with creeping horror that I could understand them now, not the words, but the meaning behind them. They were hungry. They were calling me. They were inviting me to join them in the deep woods, where the old ways still held power. I fired around through the bedroom doorway. The report was deafening in the confined space, and the whispers cut off instantly. I sat there with my ears ringing, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped the rifle. That was when I noticed my reflection in the window. My eyes were glowing, just faintly, with a pale greenish light. I touched my face, and the reflection did the same, but there was something wrong with the proportions. Something elongated about the jaw, something hungry in the expression that was not mine. I ran. I did not wait for dawn. I did not pack my belongings. I grabbed my keys, threw on my parka, and ran to where my snowmobile was parked under its tarp beside the cabin. My hands were clumsy with cold and fear as I ripped away the covering and mounted the machine. It started on the second pull, and I accelerated away from that cabin without looking back, following my own tracks from 3 days earlier through the darkness. Behind me, I could hear them, not following but calling, their voices rising in that terrible chant that promised hunger and winter and an end to loneliness in the most horrible way imaginable. I made it to the Tremblay's cabin around 6:30 in the morning. I pounded on their door until Marcel Tremblay answered in his bathrobe, looking alarmed. I must have looked insane, frost in my beard, my eyes wild, babbling about tracks and whispers and something living in the woods around my cabin. But Marcel did not laugh or dismiss me. His face went pale and he pulled me inside. His wife, Celeste, made me tea with shaking hands while Marcel told me what I should have been told before I ever went to that cabin. The area had a history, he explained. The Algonquin people had stories about the deep woods north of the park, about a hunger spirit that walked on winter nights, about people who went into the forest alone and came back changed, if they came back at all. There had been disappearances over the years, hikers and hunters who vanished without a trace, and there had been sightings of something tall and wrong moving through the trees, something that left those impossible tracks in the snow. Marcel called it by its Algonquin name, Wendigo. a spirit of endless hunger, of cannibalism, of winter itself given malevolent form. He said the old people knew to avoid certain areas during the dark months, that the company should never have maintained a cabin in that particular valley, that every few years someone reported the same things I had experienced. Marcel drove me to town in his truck that afternoon, and I never returned to the cabin. I called my boss from a motel in Huntsville and quit over the phone, giving no explanation beyond a family emergency. I found out later that the company sent someone to retrieve my belongings and close up the cabin for the season. That person reported nothing unusual, found the cabin in perfect condition, saw no tracks, and no evidence of disturbance. But I knew better. Whatever had circled my cabin those January nights had let me go, had allowed me to flee, perhaps because I had not yet crossed some invisible threshold into becoming what it wanted me to become. I moved to Ottawa shortly after, took a job doing corporate team-building events, traded the wilderness I had loved for concrete and crowds and artificial light. I have not been back to Algonquin Park. I have not spent a night alone in the woods since January 2019, and I check my reflection obsessively, multiple times a day, searching for any hint of that greenish glow in my eyes, any elongation of my features, any sign that the hunger followed me out of those dark woods. So far, I've seen nothing. But sometimes, on the coldest winter nights when the wind howls against my apartment windows, I hear whispers in a language I should not understand, and I remember that invitation into the darkness, and I wonder how long I can keep refusing it. I shared this story as a warning to anyone who thinks the wilderness is empty, who believes that isolation equals safety, who imagines that the old stories are just superstition. The Wendigo is real, or something wearing that name is real, and it waits in the deep places where winter never truly ends. If you hear whispers in the woods, if you see those impossible tracks in the snow, if you feel that gnawing hunger that no amount of food can satisfy, then run. Run before you become what stalks those frozen forests, before the hunger takes root in your chest and makes you one with the darkness. I got out, but every day I wonder if I truly escaped, or if I am simply waiting for the transformation to complete, for the day when I look in the mirror and see something ancient and hungry looking back with my face. The silence hit me the moment I drove into the hamlet of Caribou Crossing, Manitoba, on that overcast afternoon in March 2017, and I realized there was not a single person on the streets. I was 29 then, a documentary filmmaker specializing in rural depopulation across the Canadian prairies, and I had driven approximately 180 miles north from Winnipeg to interview residents of this small community that had somehow survived while neighboring towns withered and died. According to the most recent census data, Caribou Crossing had a population of 247 people, most of them descendants of Ukrainian and Métis settlers who had farmed this land for over a century. I had scheduled interviews with the mayor, the pastor of the local Lutheran church, and 3 longtime residents who had agreed to share their stories on camera. None of them answered when I knocked on their doors that afternoon. The town itself consisted of one main street roughly half a mile long, lined with the typical structures of prairie settlements. A grain elevator painted red and white, a general store with a false front that belonged to another era, a small brick building that served as both post office and municipal office, a white clapboard church with steeple, perhaps 30 houses of various ages and states of repair, and not much else. The place had that weathered, wind-scraped appearance common to Manitoba towns where the sky feels too big and the horizon stretches endlessly in all directions. But something was wrong beyond the absence of people. The wrongness was in the details. The general store's door stood open, swinging gently in the cold wind. A pickup truck sat idling in front of the church, its engine running, keys in the ignition, driver's door ajar. Lights were on in several houses. Smoke rose from at least 4 chimneys. But there were no people. I parked my rented SUV in front of the general store and got out, calling hello into the wind. My voice seemed to vanish into the vast emptiness of the prairie. No dogs barked. No curtains twitched in windows. Nothing moved except the open door of the store and a piece of newspaper tumbling down the empty street. I approached the idling truck first, thinking perhaps someone had just stepped away momentarily. The cab was warm, the radio playing soft country music, and a cup of coffee sat in the holder still steaming. The driver had been there minutes ago, maybe less, but there were no footprints in the patchy snow leading away from the vehicle, no indication of where they had gone. I tried my cell phone. No service, which was not unusual in remote areas, but I had checked before leaving the highway and had at least 2 bars. Now I had nothing. I walked to the general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming cheerfully. The interior smelled of coffee and dust and something else, something faintly chemical that I could not identify. The lights were on. The coffee maker behind the counter was half full and still warm. On the counter sat a half-eaten sandwich and an open cash register with bills and coins visible in the drawer. On the floor near the back of the store lay a shopping basket containing milk, bread, and eggs. It was as if everyone had simply vanished mid-action, mid-thought, mid-life. I spent the next hour going door to door, knocking, calling out, trying every unlocked entrance I could find. I found meals half-eaten on kitchen tables, televisions playing 2 empty rooms, a bathtub still full of cooling water, children's toys scattered across living room floors, a dog bowl filled with food that no animal had touched. In one house, I found a birthday cake on the dining room table with 28 candles. Only 12 of them burned down, as if the celebration had been interrupted moments after the singing began. The wrongness intensified with each empty house, each interrupted life. This was not evacuation. This was not planned. This was something else entirely. I returned to the municipal office and forced open the locked filing cabinet in the back room. I'm not proud of breaking in, but I needed answers, and I was growing increasingly frightened as the afternoon light began to fail. What I found in those files made my hands shake as I photographed page after page with my camera. The census records showed discrepancies that should have been impossible. The official population of 247 residents listed in the 2016 census matched the voter registration and health records, but there was another document dated 1987, a yellowed typewritten report from Manitoba Provincial Services that listed Caribou Crossing as relocated population 0 status closed. According to this document, the entire town had been evacuated overnight on March 15, 1987, exactly 30 years ago to the day. The reason given was environmental contamination requiring immediate relocation. But if the town was evacuated in 1987, who had been living here? Who had I been scheduled to interview? I photographed everything I could find and was preparing to leave when I heard a voice behind me say, "You should not be reading those files." I spun around to find a woman standing in the doorway, perhaps 35 years old with dark hair and eyes that seemed too large for her thin face. She wore a heavy winter coat and boots caked with mud, and she watched me with an expression that mixed fear and resignation. Her name was Harper, she told me, and she was the only one left because she had been outside the town limits when it happened. "When what happened?" I asked. She closed the door behind her and told me a story that defied everything I thought I knew about reality. Harper explained that Caribou Crossing was not a normal town, had not been normal since the mining disaster of 1923. A small mining operation on the edge of town had broken through into something that should not have been there, a cavern system that extended deep beneath the prairie, filled with some kind of gas or substance that drove the miners insane before killing them. 7 men died in that initial breach. The mine was sealed, the company went bankrupt, and the town tried to move on. But every 30 years, on March 15th, something happened. In 1953, 12 people vanished overnight. In 1987, the entire population. And now, in 2017, it had happened again. Harper said her grandmother had been one of the survivors of the 1953 event, that the old woman had warned her family never to be in Caribou Crossing on the anniversary, to always be elsewhere when March 15th arrived. Harper had been visiting friends in Winnipeg, had returned to find the town exactly as I had found it, empty and interrupted, with no trace of where 247 people could have gone. I did not want to believe her. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that there had to be another explanation, that mass disappearances did not happen in modern Canada. But then Harper led me to the old mine site on the eastern edge of town, and I heard it. A humming, low and rhythmic, rising from the ground itself. The earth around the sealed mine entrance was disturbed, great cracks radiating outward through the frozen soil, and from those cracks came wisps of something that looked like steam but smelled like copper and rotting meat. The humming intensified as we approached, and I felt it in my bones, a vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Harper grabbed my arm and pulled me back, saying we needed to leave immediately, that the sun was setting and nothing should be here after dark. We ran back to my SUV, but Harper insisted we take her truck instead, parked behind the church. She said my rental would be tracked, that questions would be asked, that I needed to trust her if I wanted to survive this. I grabbed my camera equipment and got into her battered Ford pickup, and we accelerated out of Caribou Crossing just as the sun touched the horizon. I looked back once and saw them, or thought I saw them, emerging from the ground near the old mine site. Shadows that stood upright but moved wrong, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, their shapes elongated and flickering as if they could not quite maintain solidity in the fading light. Harper drove faster, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, and told me not to look back, that looking made it worse, that the disappeared were down there somewhere, and what came up in their place was something else entirely. We drove straight through to Winnipeg, stopping only once for gas in a small town where Harper paid cash and avoided the security cameras. She explained that the government knew about Caribou Crossing, had known since at least 1953, that the evacuation in 1987 had been an attempt to close the town permanently. But somehow people had returned, drawn back over the years, repopulating the empty houses, living their lives as if the town had never been closed. Harper believed the mine, or whatever was beneath the mine, called people to it, needed people for some purpose that human minds could not comprehend. Every 30 years it took them, pulled them down into the earth, and used them for something. She did not know what. She did not want to know. I went to the authorities, of course. I went to the RCMP detachment in Winnipeg the next morning, with Harper beside me, and showed them my photographs and told them my story. They listened politely, took notes, and said they would investigate. 2 days later, a representative from Manitoba Provincial Services contacted me and explained that Caribou Crossing was an abandoned settlement, had been abandoned since 1987, and that any structures I had found were derelict buildings occasionally used by squatters and vandals. They suggested I had been confused, disoriented perhaps by the remote location and long drive. They strongly suggested I delete my photographs and footage and stop making inquiries that could damage Manitoba's reputation and discourage tourism. When I refused, they had my documentary funding pulled by pressuring my grant sponsors. When I tried to return to Caribou Crossing a week later, I found the highway blocked by construction barriers and detour signs that led away from the town. By the time I found an alternate route 3 days later, Caribou Crossing was gone, not abandoned, not derelict, gone. Every building had been demolished, every structure removed. The land graded flat and empty as if the town had never existed. The old mine site had been filled with concrete, dozens of truckloads of it, sealed under a cap that must have been 20 feet thick. No historical markers, no signs, just empty prairie stretching to the horizon. I photographed the emptiness, but my photographs proved nothing. Grass was already growing through the disturbed soil. Within a year, you would never know a town had stood there for over a century. Harper vanished shortly after giving her statement to the RCMP. I tried to contact her for weeks, but her phone number stopped working. Her apartment in Winnipeg was empty, and no one seemed to know where she had gone. I suspect she was relocated, given a new identity perhaps, or perhaps she simply ran as far from Manitoba as she could get. I do not blame her. I left Manitoba myself 6 months later, moved to Vancouver, and tried to continue my career documenting rural life. But I cannot forget Caribou Crossing, cannot stop wondering where those 247 people went, what purpose they served in the darkness beneath the prairie. And I cannot stop thinking about the cycle, about 30 years from now, in 2047, when March 15th arrives again and something beneath the earth begins to hum and call people to it once more. I still have my photographs, stored in 3 different secure locations, encrypted and backed up. I share this story now as documentation, as testimony, as proof that something impossible happened in Manitoba in March 2017. The government denies it. The records have been altered or destroyed, but I was there. I saw the empty town, read the files, heard the humming from beneath the earth. And I know that somewhere in the Canadian prairies, in places where the population seems improbably stable despite economic collapse and youth flight, there might be other towns like Caribou Crossing, other communities sustained by something older and darker than human ambition, waiting for their appointed time to drag their inhabitants down into the hungry earth. Watch the census data. Watch for towns that should be dying but somehow persist. Watch for March 15th. And if you ever find yourself driving through rural Manitoba and stumble upon a town that seems too quiet, too preserved, too empty despite all the signs of recent life, do not stop. Do not investigate. Just drive away as fast as you can and pray that whatever lives beneath the prairie has not noticed you. The coffin lid creaked open in my funeral home basement around 4 in the morning that October night in 2016, and I knew immediately something was very, very wrong. I was 34 then, the 3rd generation of my family to run Hayes & Sons funeral services in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I had been working the night shift preparing a body for a morning viewing when I heard that sound. Not the simple creak of settling wood or temperature changes, but the deliberate groaning of hinges under pressure, as if something inside the sealed casket was pushing upward. The casket in question held the body of Margaret Holloway, an 82-year-old woman who had died 3 days earlier of what her doctor had certified as heart failure. I had embalmed her myself that afternoon, sealed the casket at the family's request, and left her in the viewing room while I worked on another client in the preparation area. There should have been no sound from that room. There should have been nothing but the respectful silence of the dead. I stood in the doorway of the preparation room with my gloved hands still holding embalming tools, listening to that awful creaking sound echo through the basement. My funeral home was a converted Victorian mansion on Barrington Street, built in 1887, with the public viewing rooms on the main floor and the preparation facilities in the basement where the old servants' quarters and kitchen had been. The basement had concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, stainless steel tables, and all the modern equipment necessary for my profession, but it still retained some of the original structure, including the heavy oak door that separated the preparation area from the viewing room. That door was closed. I'd closed it myself, but I could hear the creaking clearly through the wood, and beneath the creaking, something else. Scratching. The unmistakable sound of fingernails dragging across satin lining. I forced myself to move, to cross the basement and open that door. Professional obligation warred with primal fear as I turned the handle and stepped into the viewing room. The casket sat on its brass stand beneath soft lighting, exactly as I had left it. The lid was closed, but even as I watched, the scratching intensified, and the lid shifted, rising perhaps an inch before settling back down. I approached on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, my rational mind cataloging impossible explanations. Rigor mortis did not work this way. Post-mortem muscle contractions did not produce deliberate scratching sounds. The dead did not wake. The dead did not move. But Margaret Holloway's casket was moving. I opened the lid with shaking hands, and what I saw made my stomach turn. Margaret lay exactly as I had positioned her, hands folded over her chest, eyes closed, face peaceful in the careful restoration work I had performed. But her fingernails, the ones I had cleaned and painted with tasteful rose polish at her daughter's request, were torn and bloody. Strips of satin lining hung from her fingers, and deep gouges scored the interior lid of the casket where she had clawed at it. Her mouth, which I had carefully positioned into a serene expression, was open in a rictus of terror, and her eyes, which I had sealed shut with eye caps and adhesive, were wide and staring and still held the faintest gleam of awareness before it faded as I watched. Margaret Holloway had been alive when I sealed her casket. She had woken during her own viewing preparation and had died again, truly died, alone in the darkness of her coffin, clawing desperately for escape that never came. I stumbled backward, fell against the wall, and vomited into a waste bin. My entire understanding of my profession, of death itself, shattered in that moment. I had examined Margaret thoroughly before embalming. I had checked for vital signs, as I always did. There had been no pulse, no respiration, no pupil response, nothing to indicate life. Her doctor had pronounced her dead. Her family had sat with her body for an hour before it was transported to my facility. How could she have been alive? How could this have happened? And if it had happened to Margaret, had it happened to others? The thought paralyzed me with horror. How many of the hundreds of bodies I had prepared over my decade in this profession might have woken in their caskets after I sealed them? How many had died alone in the darkness because I failed to detect some rare condition that mimicked death perfectly? I called the RCMP immediately, though my hands shook so badly I could barely dial. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who seemed skeptical until I described the bloody fingernails and torn lining in detail. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, and after examining the body and casket, they called their supervisor, who called the medical examiner, who arrived with the dawn. Dr. Patricia Chen, the medical examiner, was a thorough woman in her 50s, who examined Margaret's body with meticulous care, before turning to me with an expression I could not read. She said the scratches and injuries were definitely ante-mortem, meaning Margaret had been alive when they occurred. She said a full autopsy would be required, and she said something else, something that made my blood freeze. She asked if I had received any unusual bodies recently, any deaths that seemed sudden or unexpected, any clients who came from Harborview Nursing Home. Harborview was a long-term care facility on the eastern edge of Halifax, a sprawling modern building that housed approximately 150 elderly residents. I had handled 7 bodies from Harborview in the past 18 months, which was not unusual given the size of the facility and the average age of its residents. But Dr. Chen's question made me think, made me remember details I had dismissed as unremarkable at the time. 3 of those 7 bodies had shown minor abrasions on their fingertips. I had attributed it to scratching from confused dementia patients or rough handling during transport. Now I wondered if it had been something else, if those individuals had also woken after being declared dead, had clawed weakly at their surroundings before slipping away again. Dr. Chen requested the files on all 7 Harborview deaths, and when she reviewed them, a pattern emerged that should have been obvious, but somehow had been overlooked by everyone involved. All 7 individuals had been declared dead by the same physician, Dr. Charlotte Reeves, a 67-year-old general practitioner who had worked at Harborview for 22 years. All 7 had died suddenly of apparent heart failure or stroke, despite being in relatively stable condition hours before, and all 7 had been transported to funeral homes within 90 minutes of death pronouncement, unusually fast even by nursing home standards. Dr. Chen took her findings to the police, and I was questioned extensively about my procedures, my observations, anything I could remember about those 7 bodies. I told them everything, including the fingertip abrasions, including the uneasy feeling I had dismissed as professional paranoia when I prepared the 4th Harborview body and thought I saw the chest move just once, before deciding it was my imagination. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police exhumed the bodies of all 7 individuals I had prepared from Harborview, and the autopsies revealed what Dr. Chen had suspected. 3 of them showed clear evidence of having regained consciousness after burial: scratch marks inside coffin lids, splinters under fingernails, signs of suffocation rather than the original declared causes of death. The other 4 were too decomposed to make definitive determinations, but circumstantial evidence suggested similar fates. The families were devastated. I was devastated, and Dr. Charlotte Reeves was arrested at her home in Bedford on 8 counts of attempted murder and 3 counts of murder. The truth that emerged during the investigation was more horrifying than I could have imagined. Dr. Reeves had been administering a drug called vecuronium, a paralyzing agent used in surgical procedures, to patients she selected based on criteria only she understood. The drug induced complete paralysis, including respiratory muscles, creating the appearance of death, while the victim remained conscious and aware. The paralysis would eventually wear off after several hours, by which time the victim had usually been embalmed or buried. Dr. Reeves had been doing this for at least 4 years, possibly longer. When police searched her home, they found detailed journals documenting 23 victims, including extensive notes on her selection process, dosage calculations, and observations of how long families grieved. She had been conducting an experiment, she told police during interrogation, studying the nature of consciousness and death, proving that modern medicine had lost the ability to truly confirm death in an age of mechanical certification. I was called to testify at her trial in 2017, describing in detail the condition of Margaret Holloway's body, the scratches inside the casket, the terror frozen on her face. The defense argued diminished capacity, suggested Dr. Reeves suffered from dementia herself, but the prosecution presented those journals as evidence of clear planning and deliberation. She was convicted on 11 counts, the only ones with sufficient physical evidence to prosecute, and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. But the damage extended far beyond those 11 victims. The investigation uncovered similar suspicious deaths at 2 other nursing homes where Dr. Reeves had previously worked, in Dartmouth and Truro, but those cases were too old to prosecute successfully. The probable victim count exceeded 30 individuals. The experience destroyed me in ways I am still discovering. I sold Hayes and Sons funeral services 6 months after the trial concluded, unable to open another casket without wondering if the person inside might suddenly wake, might beg for release, might die again because I failed to save them. I developed severe claustrophobia, cannot ride in elevators, or sit in movie theaters, or sleep in rooms without open doors. I see Dr. Reeves in my nightmares, her calm elderly face explaining that I had been part of her experiment too, that every body I prepared might have been alive, that I would never know for certain how many people I buried while consciousness still flickered behind their closed eyes. The families of the victims sued Harborview Nursing Home, the Provincial Health Authority, and every funeral home involved, including mine. Most cases settled out of court. I testified in every proceeding I was asked to attend, describing procedures and observations, accepting whatever blame was assigned to me. The Canadian Funeral Services Association implemented new protocols requiring multiple confirmation checks before preparation could begin, including mandatory waiting periods and additional verification by independent physicians. But protocols cannot undo what happened. rules cannot unbury the people who woke in darkness and died alone. I work now in medical equipment sales, as far from death care as I could get while still using some portion of my training. I live in a small apartment in downtown Halifax with windows that open and doors that never lock. I avoid funerals. I avoid nursing homes. I avoid thinking about those 7 bodies I prepared, about Margaret Holloway's torn fingernails and desperate scratches, about the 3 victims who definitely regained consciousness after I had already begun preparation procedures. Did they feel the embalming fluid entering their arteries? Did they understand what was happening to them? Did they blame me in those final moments of true death? These questions have no answers, but they wait for me every night when I try to sleep, patient and terrible and inescapable. I share this story as a warning and a confession, a warning that the systems we trust to distinguish death from life are imperfect, that doctors can be monsters, that the transition we call death is more complex and uncertain than we like to believe, and a confession that I failed, that my professional certainty blinded me to signs I should have questioned, that people died in the worst way imaginable because I accepted appearances without doubt. If you have elderly family members in care facilities, question sudden deaths, demand second opinions, insist on longer waiting periods before preparation. Do not let what happened to Margaret Holloway and the others happen to someone you love. And if you work in death care, check again. Check one more time. Live with doubt, because the alternative, the certainty that leads to sealing someone alive in their casket, is a burden that will break you as surely as it broke me. The bride in the bloody wedding dress appeared in my hotel room mirror around 2:30 in the morning, that Valentine's Day in 2018, and she was not smiling. I was 26 then, working as a night concierge at the Banff Springs Hotel in Alberta, one of the grand railway hotels built by the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1888, and allegedly one of the most haunted locations in Canada. I had heard all the ghost stories during my training, had smiled politely at the tales of phantom brides and vanishing bellmen, had dismissed them as marketing tools designed to attract tourists who wanted a thrill with their mountain vacation. I was not a believer in the supernatural. I was a practical person who needed a job and did not mind working overnight shifts in a beautiful historic building. That belief system lasted exactly 6 weeks, until the night she appeared in my mirror and I understood that some stories are told not to attract tourists, but to warn the people who work in places where the past refuses to stay buried. My shift that night had been routine until around 2 in the morning. I was stationed at the desk in the historic wing, the original section of the hotel that dated back to the 1920s reconstruction, after a fire destroyed much of the original building. This wing was less popular with guests, despite its architectural beauty. The rooms, decorated in period style with heavy furniture and old-fashioned fixtures that some visitors found charming and others found unsettling. I had checked in 3 late arrivals, answered questions about ski conditions and restaurant hours, and was reading a novel during the quiet hours when all sensible people were asleep. The hotel corridors were silent except for the constant creaking that old buildings make, the settling of century-old timbers, and the whisper of heating systems pushing air through ancient ductwork. I was accustomed to those sounds. They no longer registered as unusual or threatening, but the sound that drew my attention around 2:15 was different. It was music, faint and distant, the kind of waltz that would have been played at elegant parties 100 years ago, drifting down from somewhere above my desk. I checked the event schedule. There were no weddings or parties that night. The ballrooms were closed. The music continued, and after a few minutes I decided to investigate, if only to confirm that someone had left a television or radio playing in an empty function room. I took the master key card and climbed the service stairs to the ballroom level, following the music to the small ballroom at the eastern end of the historic wing. The doors were closed but not locked, and when I pushed them open, the music stopped abruptly. The ballroom was dark, empty, with chairs stacked against the walls and the dance floor bare, but the air was cold, far colder than it should have been, and I could see my breath misting in front of my face despite the building's excellent heating system. I stood in the doorway for perhaps 30 seconds, feeling foolish and inexplicably frightened, before retreating to the corridor and closing the doors behind me. I was walking back toward the stairs when I saw her for the first time. She stood at the far end of the hallway, near the grand staircase that swept down to the main floor in an elegant curve of mahogany and brass. She wore a white wedding dress from the 1920s, beaded and elaborate, with a long veil that trailed behind her, and the dress was covered in blood, dark stains spreading across the bodice and skirt, dripping onto the carpet beneath her feet. She was not transparent or ethereal like ghosts are supposed to be in movies. She looked solid and real and absolutely terrifying as she began to move toward me with a gliding motion that did not quite match normal walking. I ran. I am not proud of it, but I ran back to my desk and locked myself in the small office behind the concierge station, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might vomit. I tried to rationalize what I had seen: a guest playing a prank, someone in costume from a late party, a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But I knew the truth, even as I tried to deny it. I had seen the bride, the famous ghost of the Banff Springs Hotel, the woman who supposedly died on her wedding night in 1928 when she tripped on her dress and fell down that grand staircase, breaking her neck. The story was in every ghost tour book, on every paranormal investigation website. I had dismissed it as legend. Now I sat, shaking in my office, afraid to leave, afraid to look at the security monitors in case I saw her reflected in their screens. I called my supervisor, explained that I was not feeling well, asked if someone could relieve me early. He was sympathetic, but explained that the overnight supervisor was dealing with a situation in the main building and could not spare anyone for at least 2 hours. I would have to wait until the morning shift arrived at 7:00. I spent those hours in the office with the door locked, jumping at every sound, watching the clock with desperate attention. At 6:45, I finally worked up the courage to unlock the office and prepare for the handoff to the day shift. The historic wing was quiet, the corridors empty and normal in the pre-dawn light beginning to filter through the windows. I was packing my belongings when I passed the mirror behind the concierge desk, a large antique piece in a gilt frame that reflected the corridor and staircase. And there she was, standing directly behind me in the reflection, her ruined face twisted with rage, her bloody hands reaching for my shoulders. I spun around. The corridor was empty. But when I looked back at the mirror, she remained visible, closer now, and her mouth opened in a silent scream. I fled the hotel without waiting for the day shift, drove home to my apartment in Canmore, and called in sick for the next 3 nights. During those days, I researched everything I could find about the bride of Banff Springs Hotel. The official story was frustratingly vague on details. A bride died on her wedding night in 1928, fell down the stairs, tragedy ensued. But in old newspaper archives, I found the rest of the story, the parts the hotel preferred not to advertise. The bride's name was Catherine. She was 23 years old, marrying a wealthy businessman from Calgary, and she had not died from falling down the stairs. She had been pushed, murdered by her groom's former mistress, who had gained access to the hotel by posing as a seamstress hired to make last-minute alterations to the wedding dress. The mistress had attacked Catherine at the top of the grand staircase during the reception, stabbed her multiple times before shoving her down the stairs to make it look like an accident. The mistress was never caught, disappeared into the mountain wilderness, and was presumed dead when searchers found blood-stained clothing near a ravine but never recovered a body. The more I researched, the more I began to notice something disturbing. I looked like the mistress. The few photographs I found in archived newspapers showed a woman with my build, my dark hair, my facial structure. The resemblance was uncanny, undeniable, And suddenly Catherine's appearance and her rage made terrible sense. She thought I was the woman who murdered her, thought I had returned after 90 years, thought I had come back to mock her eternal wandering in the place where she died. I had to go back to the hotel. I could not simply quit without explanation, could not abandon my job because of a ghost, no matter how frightening. But I also could not continue working in the historic wing knowing that Catherine was waiting for me, believing I was her killer. I returned to work on my 4th scheduled shift and immediately requested a meeting with the head of security, a retired RCMP officer named Donald, who had worked at the hotel for 15 years and had heard every ghost story and dealt with every supposed paranormal incident. I explained what I had seen, showed him the photographs of the mistress, pointed out the resemblance. He listened without judgment, then told me something that made my situation much worse. There had been incidents over the years, he said, 3 previous female employees who resembled the historical mistress and who had experienced increasingly aggressive encounters with Catherine's spirit. One woman had been pushed down a service staircase and broken her arm. Another had been locked in a storage room for 6 hours until someone heard her screaming. The third had quit after being physically attacked in her staff quarters, scratched badly enough to require medical attention. Donald showed me photographs from that attack. The scratches formed words across the woman's back: murderess, thief, deceiver. Donald arranged for me to be transferred to the main building, away from the historic wing where Catherine's manifestations were concentrated. For 2 weeks, the arrangement worked. I saw no bride, experienced no phenomena, began to relax and think that perhaps the geographic distance was enough to break whatever connection Catherine had fixated on. I was wrong. On the night of March 3rd, I was working at the main building concierge desk when the temperature dropped suddenly, and I smelled something I had not encountered before: roses and copper, perfume and blood. I looked up to find Catherine standing in the middle of the busy lobby, visible to me but apparently invisible to the dozen other people moving through the space. She pointed at me with one bloody hand, and I knew that transferring buildings would not save me. She had decided I was the mistress, and she would not stop until she had her revenge. I quit the next day despite needing the income, despite loving the Banff area and not wanting to leave. I moved to Calgary, found work at a downtown hotel with no history and no ghosts, and tried to rebuild my sense of safety. But Catherine followed me. I see her sometimes in mirrors, in reflections in shop windows, in the smooth surface of my car's hood on rainy nights. She never comes close, never attacks, but her presence is constant, a reminder that I wear the face of a murderer and carry a guilt that is not mine, but which Catherine cannot distinguish from the real thing. I consulted with paranormal investigators, with indigenous spiritual advisors, with a Catholic priest who performed a blessing over my apartment. Nothing has made her leave entirely. The best I have managed is to reduce her appearances from daily to weekly, from clear manifestations to fleeting shadows at the edge of vision. I contacted one of the previous employees who had experienced Catherine's attacks, a woman named Jennifer who now lived in Vancouver. She told me that the haunting had faded over time, that Catherine had eventually lost interest as years passed, and the resemblance to her killer became less relevant as fashions changed, and Jennifer aged beyond the mistress's eternal 30-year-old appearance. Jennifer said I needed to be patient, to endure, to wait out a ghost's obsession the way you might wait out a stalker's fixation. She also warned me never to return to the Banff Springs Hotel because proximity to the place where Catherine died would intensify the haunting, might even give the spirit enough strength to cause real physical harm. I have heeded that warning. I have not been back to Banff, avoid the mountains entirely, and plan my life around staying as far from that historic hotel as possible. I share this story as a warning to anyone who works in historic hotels or buildings with documented hauntings. The ghosts are real, or something wearing that name is real, and they carry grudges that span decades and centuries. If you resemble someone from a building's tragic history, if you find yourself experiencing impossible phenomena, if you see figures that others cannot see, then leave. Your job is not worth the psychological damage of being hunted by something that died before you were born. I thought I was practical and sensible and immune to superstition. Catherine taught me that the dead do not care about skepticism, that trauma echoes through time in ways we do not understand, and that some places hold their tragedies so tightly that the past becomes present, and the boundary between life and death dissolves into something that traps the living as surely as it traps the dead. I got out, but Catherine's face still watches me from reflections, patient and accusing and eternally convinced that I owe her a debt I can never pay. My truck headlights caught the figure standing in the middle of the frozen ice road around 11 in the evening that February night in 2015, approximately 200 miles north of Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and every instinct I had screamed at me to keep driving. I was 38 then, an ice road trucker with 12 years of experience hauling supplies to remote diamond mines and isolated communities across the frozen lakes and tundra of Canada's far north. The ice roads are temporary highways that exist only during the coldest months, routes across frozen lakes and rivers that disappear with the spring thaw, and driving them requires constant vigilance, knowledge of ice conditions, and respect for the brutal environment that can kill you in minutes if something goes wrong. I had made this particular run dozens of times, knew every landmark and hazard, understood the rhythm of solitude that comes with 16-hour shifts in a truck cabin with nothing but darkness and endless white stretching in every direction. But I had never seen someone standing alone in the middle of the road at 11 at night in minus 40-degree temperatures, and I knew immediately that something was very wrong with this situation. The figure was a woman, or appeared to be a woman from the silhouette visible in my headlights. She wore what looked like a thin jacket, no parka or proper cold weather gear, and she stood perfectly still as my truck approached, not waving for help or moving to the side of the road. I slowed down, my rig's diesel engine rumbling as I downshifted, and reached for the CB radio to report the situation to dispatch. But the radio produced only static, which was unusual. I always had communication at this point in the route, even if reception was sometimes poor. I brought the truck to a complete stop about 50 feet from the figure and rolled down my window, the cold air hitting me like a physical blow despite my heavy clothing. I called out to ask if she needed help, if her vehicle had broken down, if she was injured. She did not respond. She just stood there in my headlights, and as my eyes adjusted, I realized something that made my stomach clench with fear. She was not wearing shoes. Her feet were bare on the ice, and she was not shivering or showing any signs of hypothermia despite exposure that should have killed her within minutes. I grabbed my emergency kit and climbed down from the cab, leaving the engine running and the lights on. The cold was vicious, the kind of cold that makes breathing painful and freezes moisture in your nostrils instantly. I approached the woman slowly, calling out to her, but she still did not respond or acknowledge my presence. Then she moved, not toward me but away, walking with stiff mechanical steps toward the darkness beyond my headlights. She pointed with one arm extended, indicating something off the road, and then she vanished. Not walked into the darkness, but vanished. Blinked out of existence like someone had. Switched off a light. I stood there with my flashlight shaking in my hand, my rational mind trying to process what I had just witnessed, while some deeper survival instinct urged me to get back in my truck and leave immediately. But I did not leave. I moved my flashlight in the direction she had pointed and saw something that made me forget about the impossible disappearing woman. There were tracks in the snow leading off the road, vehicle tracks from something smaller than my rig, maybe a pickup truck or SUV. I followed them with my flashlight beam and spotted the vehicle about 100 yards from the road, partially obscured by drifted snow. It was a white Ford pickup with northern plates, and the driver's door was hanging open. I approached carefully, my mind racing through possibilities. Breakdown, accident, medical emergency, all scenarios I had encountered before in my years on the ice roads. But none of those scenarios explained the barefoot woman who had vanished, and none of them explained the feeling of dread that intensified with every step I took toward that abandoned vehicle. I reached the truck and shone my light inside. The cab was empty, but the keys were still in the ignition, and there was a child's car seat in the back, a pink and purple seat designed for a toddler. On the passenger seat sat a woman's purse, wallet visible inside with identification cards and cash still present. And on the snow beside the truck, barely visible in the drifting powder, were dark stains that could only be blood. I keyed my radio again, got nothing but static, and made the decision to investigate further. Following the blood trail and footprints in the snow, I walked approximately 75 yards to a small ice fishing hut that I had not noticed from the road. Light flickered through gaps in the hut's plywood walls, and I could hear voices inside, men talking in low, urgent tones. And beneath those adult voices, I heard something that made my blood run cold despite the brutal temperature. A child was crying. That particular exhausted, whimpering cry that children make when they have been crying for a long time and have no more energy for full sobs. I approached the hut as quietly as possible, which was difficult given the crunching snow beneath my boots, and positioned myself to look through one of the gaps in the wall. What I saw inside made me understand immediately that I had stumbled onto something far worse than a simple accident or stranded motorist. There were 6 people inside the hut, 4 women and 2 young children, all of them indigenous based on their appearance, all of them bound with zip ties and duct tape. Their faces showed bruises and signs of prolonged fear and suffering, and standing over them with a rifle in his hands was a man I recognized from truck stop posters, a man wanted in connection with the disappearances of multiple indigenous women across the Northern Territories. His name was Calvin Murdoch, and he was not alone. A second man sat on a bench loading supplies into backpacks, and they were clearly preparing to move their captives somewhere else. I backed away from the hut as quietly as I could and ran back to my truck, my lungs burning from the cold air and exertion. My CB radio still produced only static, but my truck was equipped with a satellite phone for emergencies, and I grabbed it from its mount and dialed the RCMP emergency line. The call connected after what felt like an eternity, and I whispered my location and situation to the dispatcher, describing what I had found and requesting immediate assistance. The dispatcher told me that the nearest RCMP unit was approximately 90 minutes away, that I should retreat to a safe distance and wait for backup. But 90 minutes might as well have been 90 years for those people in the hut. In 90 minutes, Murdoch and his accomplice could move the captives, could drive off across the ice in any direction, and disappear into the vast emptiness of the Northern Territories. I made a decision that probably should have gotten me killed, but which I could not avoid making. I was going to do something to delay them, to prevent them from leaving before the RCMP arrived. I opened the external storage compartment on my truck and found what I was looking for, a tire iron and a can of emergency road flares. I also grabbed a heavy chain I used for securing cargo. Then I approached the white pickup truck and used the tire iron to smash the ignition, ripping out wires and ensuring the vehicle would not start without significant repair work. I moved as quickly as I could back toward my truck, but I was not quick enough. Behind me, I heard the door of the ice fishing hut bang open and Murdoch's voice shouting for someone to check on the truck. I ran, my boots slipping on the ice, and made it back to my rig just as I heard the crack of a rifle shot and felt something punch into the side of my truck's trailer. I threw myself into the cab and accelerated, the truck's massive engine responding with a roar as I drove back the way I had come, headlights bouncing crazily across the frozen landscape. Behind me, I could see the beams of flashlights and hear the pop of more rifle fire. but the distance was increasing and the shots were going wide. I drove for approximately 3 miles before I felt safe enough to stop, positioning my truck sideways across the ice road to block it completely. If Murdoch had another vehicle hidden somewhere, if he tried to drive his captives out on the road, he would have to get through my 40-ton rig first. I grabbed the satellite phone and updated the RCMP dispatcher on the new situation, and then I waited in the darkness with my truck's engine running and my own rifle across my lap, watching my mirrors for any sign of approaching vehicles. The wait was excruciating. Every minute felt like an hour as I sat there wondering if I had done the right thing, if I had just condemned myself and those captives to death by interfering. The temperature in my cab was comfortable, but I was shaking anyway, adrenaline and fear coursing through my system. Then, around 1:30 in the morning, I saw lights approaching from behind me, from the direction of Yellowknife. It was a convoy of 3 RCMP vehicles, heavy-duty SUVs equipped for ice road travel, and I have never been so relieved to see police in my entire life. I explained the situation in person to the lead officer, a sergeant named Mackenzie who had been tracking Murdoch for 8 months. She told me to stay with my truck while her team approached the fishing hut, and I watched through binoculars as the RCMP moved in with tactical precision, surrounding the hut and calling for surrender through loudspeakers. What happened next unfolded quickly. Murdoch and his accomplice attempted to flee, running out onto the ice of the frozen lake with the intention of disappearing into the darkness. But the ice in that area was unstable, weakened by unusual weather patterns and underground currents. I heard the crack from where I sat, a sound like thunder rolling across the frozen landscape, and saw the ice give way beneath both men. They vanished into the black water, and despite immediate rescue attempts by the RCMP, neither man survived. The cold water kills in minutes, and the current beneath the ice carries bodies away into depths that never give them back. The captives were rescued without further incident. All 6 women and children were alive, suffering from exposure and trauma, but alive. They were transported immediately to Yellowknife Hospital for treatment and evaluation. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what Murdoch had been doing. He had been operating a trafficking network targeting indigenous women and children across the Northwest Territories, Alberta, and northern Saskatchewan for at least 3 years. The fishing hut had been one of multiple temporary holding locations where he kept victims before transporting them further south for exploitation. The RCMP recovered evidence linking him to 23 confirmed kidnappings and suspected involvement in at least a dozen unsolved disappearances. The woman I had seen standing in the road, the barefoot figure who pointed me toward the abandoned truck, was never identified or explained. When I described her to the RCMP and to the rescued captives, one of the older women became very quiet and then told me something that I still think about every day. She said that spirits sometimes intervene when evil becomes too great, that the land itself rises up to protect those who belong to it, that I had been guided by something older than any road or mine or human settlement. I do not know if I believe in spirits, but I know what I saw, and I know that I found those captives because something impossible led me to them. The experience changed me in ways I am still discovering. I continued working as an ice road trucker for 2 more seasons before the nightmares became too much and I transitioned to dispatching work, coordinating routes and safety protocols from an office in Yellowknife. I work now with Indigenous women's advocacy groups, supporting organizations that combat trafficking and violence against Indigenous people in remote communities. The families of the rescued captives have become part of my extended family, and I attend ceremonies and gatherings where I am welcomed as someone who helped in a moment of darkness. But I also carry the weight of knowing that 2 men died on the ice that night, that my actions directly led to their deaths, even if those deaths were accidental, and even if those men deserved whatever justice or fate found them. The RCMP cleared me of any wrongdoing, praised my intervention as heroic, but I still see those lights vanishing beneath the ice in my dreams. still hear the crack of the ice giving way, and wonder if there was another way the situation could have ended. I share this story as testimony to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, a crisis that continues despite increased awareness and government inquiries. The Northern Territories are vast and remote, and predators operate in the spaces between communities where resources are scarce and attention is difficult to maintain. If you drive the ice roads or work in remote areas, pay attention to details that seem wrong. Trust your instincts when something feels off, and understand that you might be the only person in position to help someone in desperate need. The barefoot woman in my headlights guided me to those captives, whether she was spirit or hallucination or manifestation of something I cannot explain. And sometimes I drive past that section of ice road when my dispatching work requires site visits, and I look for her in the darkness, wondering if she still stands there, pointing the way toward people who need help, wondering if other drivers have seen her and followed where she leads. I have not seen her since that February night in 2015, but I watch for her always, and I carry the memory of 6 lives saved and 2 lives lost on frozen water that holds its secrets forever beneath layers of ice that form and melt and form again with the turning seasons. The fog rolled in around the Fisgard Lighthouse near Victoria, British Columbia that September evening in 2014, and I realized I had not seen my partner Lucas in over 6 hours. I was 32 then, working as a lighthouse keeper on a remote island off the Vancouver Island coast, one of the few remaining manned lighthouse stations in Canada after decades of automation had eliminated most keeper positions. The job was a dream for someone like me who craved solitude and meaningful work away from the chaos of urban life. I had applied for the position after burning out from a tech career in Vancouver, and the isolation of lighthouse keeping felt like exactly the reset I needed. Lucas Foster was my rotation partner, a 41-year-old former Coast Guard officer who had been keeping lighthouses for almost a decade and knew the rhythms of the work far better than I did. We worked 3-month rotations, alternating duties of maintaining the beacon, monitoring weather conditions, performing maintenance on the century-old structure, and providing reports to the Coast Guard. Lucas was quiet and professional, kept mostly to himself during off hours, and seemed perfectly content with the isolation that some keepers found unbearable after a few weeks. I had no reason to worry about him until that September evening when the fog came in like a living thing and I realized he had vanished. Our lighthouse sat on a rocky outcrop approximately 8 miles from the nearest inhabited shore, accessible only by boat and connected to the mainland by radio and modern satellite communications. The structure itself dated back to 1923, a white cylindrical tower rising 62 feet above the rocky island, with the keeper's quarters built into the base of the tower and a small cottage for the second keeper positioned about 50 yards away. The island was barely 3 acres of rock and sparse vegetation with steep cliffs dropping to the ocean on 3 sides, and a small dock on the protected 4th side where our supply boat arrived twice monthly. You could walk the entire perimeter in 15 minutes. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to get lost, nowhere for a person to disappear for 6 hours without being noticed. Yet, Lucas was gone, and the fog that surrounded our island was the thickest I had ever experienced, so dense I could not see my own hand when I extended my arm fully. I had last seen Lucas around noon when he mentioned he was going to review the old logbooks stored in the basement archive room. The lighthouse had been operational for over 90 years, and the keepers before us had maintained meticulous daily logs documenting weather conditions, ship sightings, maintenance activities, and occasionally personal observations about the isolation and challenges of the work. Lucas had developed an interest in these historical records, spending more and more of his off-duty time in the basement reading entries from keepers who had worked the lighthouse generations before us. I thought it was a harmless hobby, a way to connect with the history of the place and the long line of men who had maintained the beacon before automation threatened to make the profession obsolete. I was wrong about the harmless part. When Lucas did not appear for the 6 cruisers' evening shift change, I went looking for him. I checked his cottage first, found it empty with his bed unmade and breakfast dishes still in the sink. I checked the tower, the equipment room, the small workshop where we performed repairs. Nothing. I descended to the basement archive room, a concrete space built into the foundation of the lighthouse with metal shelving, holding decades of logbooks, supply records, and maintenance documentation. The room was lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the air smelled of mildew and old paper. Lucas was not there, but his work was visible. He had pulled perhaps a dozen logbooks from the 1890s and laid them open on the metal table in the center of the room, and he had been taking extensive notes on a yellow legal pad. I picked up the pad and read what he had written, and the first tingles of real fear began to crawl up my spine. The notes were obsessive, pages and pages of copied entries from a keeper named Samuel Whitmore, who had worked the lighthouse from 1892 to 1894. Whitmore's entries started normally enough, routine weather observations and ship traffic reports, but they gradually descended into increasingly disturbed commentary about the fog, about voices he heard in the mist, about shapes he saw moving on the rocks when the fog was thickest. Whitmore wrote about dreams of drowning, of being pulled beneath the waves by hands that were cold and impossibly strong, of waking to find his clothing soaked with seawater despite never leaving the lighthouse. And he wrote about the watchers in the mist, figures that stood just beyond visibility in the fog, waiting for something Whitmore could not understand. Lucas had copied all of this word for word, and beneath the copied entries he had written his own observations. He was experiencing the same phenomena. He heard the voices, he saw the shapes, and he believed that whatever Whitmore had encountered in 1894 was still here, still waiting in the fog. I grabbed Lucas's notes and ran back upstairs, my practical mind trying to rationalize what I had read. Isolation psychosis was a real phenomenon in lighthouse keeping. The loneliness and monotony could produce hallucinations and paranoia in susceptible individuals. Lucas had been reading disturbing historical accounts and had likely convinced himself he was experiencing similar events through the power of suggestion. That explanation felt reasonable until I reached the main floor and looked out the windows at the fog-shrouded island. Standing about 30 feet from the lighthouse, barely visible through the dense mist, was Lucas. He faced away from the building, toward the cliffs and the ocean beyond, and he was completely still. Not moving, not responding to my shouts through the window, just standing there in the freezing fog wearing only a thin sweater and pants. No jacket or boots despite the temperature being around 4 degrees Celsius. I ran outside and approached him calling his name, but he did not respond or acknowledge my presence. When I got close enough to touch his shoulder, I saw his face and barely suppressed a scream. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing, and his lips were moving in a constant whisper that I could not make out. His skin was ice cold to the touch and had taken on a bluish tint from exposure, but he showed no signs of shivering or discomfort. I shook him, shouted directly in his face, but got no response. He just kept whispering and staring into the fog. I grabbed his arm and tried to pull him back toward the lighthouse, and that is when he spoke in a voice that was his, but also not his. A voice that carried an echo like multiple people speaking slightly out of sync. He said, "They are in the water, Noah. They have been in the water since the beginning. They watch us keep the light, and they wait for the fog, and they call us to join them, where the cold and the dark are eternal." I dragged him physically back to the lighthouse, his body offering no resistance but also providing no help, moving like a sleepwalker. I got him inside and sat him in a chair near the heating stove, wrapped him in blankets, and tried to get him to drink hot tea. He remained unresponsive, his eyes still unfocused, his lips still moving in that constant whisper. I radioed the Coast Guard, and explained that I had a medical emergency, that my partner was experiencing what appeared to be severe hypothermia and possible psychological breakdown. They said they would send a boat, but the fog was making navigation extremely dangerous, and it might be several hours before they could reach us safely. I was told to keep Lucas warm, monitor his vital signs, and prevent him from leaving the building or harming himself. Those instructions sounded simple, but proved impossible to follow. Lucas stopped whispering around 80 that evening and turned his head to look directly at me for the first time since I had found him outside. His eyes had cleared somewhat, but what I saw in them was worse than the unfocused stare. He looked at me with pity and sadness, and he said, "You should not have brought me back inside, Noah. They wanted me to come to the water. They have been calling me for weeks, and I finally understood." Samuel understood too. He went to them in 1894 and they welcomed him, and now he is one of the watchers. I have to go to them. It is the only way to make the calling stop. I asked him what he was talking about, who was calling him, but he just shook his head and said I would understand when the fog called my name, when I heard the voices rising from the water, when I realized that keeping the light was not about guiding ships, but about marking ourselves for the things that lived in the depths and waited for lighthouse keepers to join them in the cold and the dark. I locked the exterior doors and hid the keys, determined to keep Lucas inside until the Coast Guard arrived. But around 10 that night, I heard him moving around in his sleeping area, and when I went to check on him, I found the window open and Lucas gone. He had climbed out through the window and vanished into the fog. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, screaming his name into the mist, but the fog swallowed all sound, and visibility was down to perhaps 5 feet. I searched frantically for an hour, covering every inch of the small island, terrified that Lucas had walked off the cliffs or was lying injured somewhere on the rocks. I found him finally at the edge of the dock, standing at the very end with his toes hanging over the edge, staring down into the black water. And he was not alone. Surrounding the dock, visible as pale shapes just beneath the surface of the water, were dozens of figures. They floated motionless just below the waterline, their faces turned upward toward the dock, their arms extended as if reaching for Lucas. And standing behind Lucas, between him and the safety of the dock, was a figure I had not seen approach. It was translucent, barely visible even in the beam of my flashlight, but it wore the clothing style of a late 19th century lighthouse keeper, and his face matched a photograph I had seen in the archive room. It was Samuel Whitmore, or something wearing his appearance, and it was speaking to Lucas in a voice like water running over stones. I ran toward them, shouting for Lucas to get away from the edge, but before I could reach the dock, Lucas stepped off the edge and dropped into the water. I dove after him without thinking, the cold Pacific water hitting me like a physical blow and stealing my breath. I surfaced, gasping, and looked around desperately for Lucas. He was floating face down about 10 feet from the dock, not moving, not swimming. I grabbed him and dragged him back to the dock, hauled him onto the wooden planks with strength I did not know I possessed. He was not breathing. I performed CPR, compression after compression, breathing air into his lungs, begging him to come back. And finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, he coughed up seawater and drew a gasping breath. His eyes opened, and they were clear, truly clear, for the first time in hours. He looked at me with confusion and said, "Noah, what happened? Why are we wet?" The Coast Guard boat arrived around midnight, and Lucas was evacuated immediately to Victoria General Hospital. He had no memory of the previous 12 hours, no recollection of standing in the fog or jumping into the water, or any of the disturbing things he had said. The doctors diagnosed severe hypothermia and possible temporal lobe seizures, recommended psychiatric evaluation, and permanent removal from isolated duty. Lucas never returned to Lighthouse, keeping. He moved back to Vancouver, and last I heard, was working in marine supply logistics, a safe office job far from the ocean and the fog. I requested immediate transfer after that night, unwilling to spend another moment on that island. But it took 3 weeks for my replacement to arrive, and during those weeks, I experienced things that confirmed everything Lucas had written in his notes and everything Samuel Whitmore had recorded in his 1890s logbook. I heard the voices in the fog calling my name, inviting me to join the watchers in the water. I saw the shapes moving on the rocks when the mist was thickest, figures that were almost human, but not quite, with proportions that were slightly wrong and movements that did not match normal human gait. I dreamed of drowning every night, of sinking into cold darkness, while pale hands pulled me deeper, and voices promised that the cold was peaceful, that the darkness was home, that I belonged in the depths with all the other lighthouse keepers who had answered the call over the decades. And I found more logbooks in the archive room, from keepers who had worked the lighthouse over its 90-year history, and a pattern emerged that the Coast Guard had either never noticed or had deliberately ignored. Every 7 to 10 years, a lighthouse keeper disappeared from the station. Sometimes their bodies were found washed up on nearby shores. Sometimes they were never found at all, but the circumstances were always similar. Thick fog, disorientation, and a final entry in the logbook about voices in the mist and watchers in the water. My replacement arrived on a clear October morning, a cheerful young woman named Patricia, who was excited about the solitude and the historical significance of the lighthouse. I wanted to warn her, wanted to show her the logbooks and explain about the voices and the shapes in the fog, but I also knew how insane it would sound, knew that she would dismiss my warnings as isolation psychosis or hazing attempts by a burned-out keeper who could not handle the solitude. So I gave her the basic orientation, showed her the equipment and procedures, and left on the same boat that brought her. I reported everything to the Coast Guard officials when I reached Victoria, showed them the logbooks and Lucas's notes and the pattern of disappearances. They thanked me for my service, processed my resignation, and I never heard another word about the investigation I was promised. The lighthouse was finally automated in 2016, 2 years after my experience there, and the keeper positions were eliminated entirely. I do not know if that decision was related to what happened to Lucas and me, or if it was simply part of the ongoing modernization of lighthouse operations. I do know that I check the marine incident reports compulsively, watching for news of disappearances or accidents near that particular lighthouse. So far, there have been none. Perhaps the watchers only called to the keepers, to the people who lived on the island and maintained the light. Perhaps automation broke whatever connection allowed them to reach out of the water and into the minds of isolated men. Or perhaps they are simply waiting, patient and eternal in the cold depths, for the day when humans return to keep the light, and the fog rolls in thick and impenetrable, and the voices begin their calling once again. I share this story as a warning and a historical record. If you work in isolated locations, especially historic sites with long operational histories, read the old logbooks and records. Pay attention to patterns of unexplained incidents or personnel problems. Trust your instincts if you begin experiencing phenomena that feel wrong or impossible. And if you ever work at a lighthouse and you hear voices calling from the fog, if you see shapes moving in the mist that are almost human but not quite, then leave immediately. Do not try to rationalize it. Do not convince yourself it is your imagination. Do not wait for the calling to intensify, because the watchers in the water are real, or something wearing that description is real, and they have been collecting lighthouse keepers for over a century, pulling them down into depths that never give back what they take. Lucas survived because I pulled him from the water before they could claim him completely. But I still see his face in my nightmares, staring down into the water while pale hands reached up from the depths, and I wonder how many other keepers were not as fortunate. How many answered the call and sank into the cold and the dark and became watchers themselves, waiting beneath the waves for the next keeper to hear their voices in the fog. My archaeology team unearthed the first skull around 10 in the morning that June day in 2013 on what should have been empty crown land outside Regina, Saskatchewan, and by sunset we had found 47 more. I was 35 then, a forensic archaeologist leading a routine survey ahead of a proposed pipeline route that would cut through approximately 80 miles of prairie between Regina and Moose Jaw. The survey was standard procedure, required by federal regulations to identify any archaeological or historical sites that might be disturbed by construction. We expected to find nothing more than perhaps some indigenous artifacts from centuries past, maybe the remains of an old homestead or trading post. What we found instead was evidence of a massacre that had been hidden for over 120 years. A mass grave containing the bodies of women and children executed with military precision and buried without ceremony or record in the middle of the vast Saskatchewan grassland. The site was unremarkable from the surface, just a slight depression in the earth that our ground-penetrating radar had flagged as an anomaly worth investigating. We began excavation at dawn, carefully removing topsoil layer by layer, according to standard archaeological protocols. The first skull appeared approximately 18 inches below the surface, a small cranium that clearly belonged to a child of perhaps 8 or 10 years old. The bone showed a bullet entry wound at the base, the unmistakable signature of an execution-style killing. I called my team over immediately, and we expanded the excavation area, working with increasing urgency as the scope of what we had discovered became clear. By noon, we had uncovered 12 complete skeletons. By sunset, the count had reached 47. All of them women and children, none of them men, all showing evidence of violent death by gunshot. The site was clearly not a battlefield, or the result of warfare in any conventional sense. The bodies had been laid out in rows, buried together in a single large pit approximately 30 feet long and 15 feet wide. There were no personal effects, no clothing fragments, no jewelry or tools, nothing that might help identify who these people were or where they had come from. But the forensic evidence was unmistakable. Every skull showed the same execution pattern, single gunshot wound to the back of the head, fired from close range, consistent with systematic murder rather than combat casualties. I documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, collected soil samples and bone fragments for laboratory analysis, and immediately contacted the RCMP to report the discovery of what appeared to be a historical crime scene. The RCMP arrived the following morning with a forensic team and a representative from the provincial coroner's office. They cordoned off the site and began their own investigation while my team continued careful excavation of the remains. Carbon dating of the bones placed the deaths sometime between 1880 and 1890, during the period following the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, when tensions between Métis settlers and the Canadian government had resulted in armed conflict and brutal suppression of Indigenous resistance. The victims were all Métis based on skeletal analysis and dental characteristics, and the age range of the children suggested multiple families had been killed together. But there was no record of any massacre in this location, no historical documentation of military action or civilian deaths, nothing in the archives that explained how 47 people came to be executed and buried in an unmarked grave on Crown land that should have been uninhabited during that period. I began my own research in parallel with the official investigation, spending weeks in the Saskatchewan Archives and Libraries and Archives Canada reviewing military records, newspaper accounts, and government correspondence from the 1880s. What I discovered was a pattern of deliberate erasure, references to events that had been redacted or removed from official documents, gaps in military deployment records that corresponded to the timeline of the massacre, and coded communications between government officials that suggested knowledge of unauthorized actions taken against Métis civilians suspected of sympathizing with Louis Riel's rebellion. The more I dug into the historical record, the clearer it became that someone in authority had ordered the systematic elimination of these families and then covered up the crime by destroying or altering official documentation. The breakthrough came when I discovered a private diary in the archives of a retired Northwest Mounted Police officer who had served in Saskatchewan during the 1880s. The diary contained an entry dated September 17, 1885, describing a night operation conducted by a military unit detached from regular command structure. The diarist, who did not participate but heard accounts from other officers, wrote that a group of approximately 50 Métis women and children, who had been identified as family members of rebellion leaders, were removed from their homes near Batoche and transported south under cover of darkness. The official story was that they were being relocated to a reserve for their own protection. The diary entry suggested otherwise, describing rumors that circulated among the ranks about a unit that never returned to base with their prisoners, about questions that were never answered, about officers who were quietly reassigned or discharged shortly after the incident. The diarist expressed his own suspicions that the prisoners had been executed to serve as a warning to other Métis families and to eliminate potential sources of future resistance. I shared this evidence with the RCMP investigators and with journalists who had begun following the story as news of the mass grave spread. The response from government officials was swift and aggressive. Within 48 hours of the diary excerpt being published in the Regina Leader Post, I received a formal notice from the Ministry of Justice requiring me to cease all independent investigation and turn over all materials related to the site to federal authorities. The notice cited national security concerns and ongoing criminal investigation protocols, but the real message was clear. Stop digging into the past or face consequences. I refused. I had spent my entire career documenting historical injustices and ensuring that forgotten victims were given voice and recognition. I was not going to let bureaucratic pressure silence the story of 47 people who had been murdered and erased from history. The retaliation was systematic and thorough. My office at the University of Saskatchewan was broken into and my research files were stolen, though nothing else of value was taken. My field notes from the excavation disappeared from a locked storage facility. My laptop was hacked, and all my digital files were corrupted or deleted despite cloud backups that were also mysteriously wiped. I began receiving threatening phone calls at odd hours, sometimes silence, sometimes warnings to drop the investigation and move on to other projects. A car followed me for 3 days before I noticed and reported it to police, who said they would investigate but never followed up. The university received anonymous complaints about my professional conduct, baseless accusations that nonetheless required formal responses and investigations that distracted from my work. It became clear that powerful interests wanted the massacre story to disappear, wanted those 47 bodies to be quietly reburied and forgotten, wanted the historical record to remain sanitized and incomplete. I found an ally in an unexpected place. A woman named Amelia, who worked as an archivist in a federal government records facility in Ottawa, contacted me through an encrypted email service. She said she had been following the news coverage of the mass grave and had found documents in restricted archives that confirmed the military's involvement in the massacre. Amelia explained that she had worked for the government for 18 years and had watched as politically sensitive historical materials were routinely reclassified or destroyed to protect institutional reputations. She said the massacre documents had been flagged for destruction, but she had made copies before they could be purged from the system. She was willing to provide those copies to me, but needed guarantees that her identity would be protected and that the documents would be released publicly in a way that made suppression impossible.